August 1944. A dusty roadside near Avranches, France. An elderly French farmer sits silently on an overturned wooden crate in the summer heat. Next to him in the dirt ditch lies a heavy draft horse, its gray coat covered in road dust and blood from a stray shell fragment that tore through the valley just after dawn. Dust clouds rise from the dirt road as a massive armored column thunders past, throwing grit into the old man's face. But he does not blink or move. He simply stares at the animal. The Third Army convoy stretches back for miles, 20 vehicles deep, filled with tanks, half-tracks, and shouting soldiers racing to exploit a breakthrough in the German lines. Every second matters. Then, the lead armored vehicle abruptly grinds to a halt, forcing the entire column to stop. This is the story of a powerful general who halted an entire army convoy in the middle of a critical military campaign to help an old French civilian. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what the general did when no one was watching. Jacques Moreau was 73 years old. For 50 winters, he had worked the same rocky soil outside Avranches. He was a small man with calloused hands, a frayed woolen vest, and a face lined by decades of hard labor. He did not care about global politics or grand military strategies. His entire world existed within the boundaries of his modest fence lines. During the long, brutal years of the German occupation, he had watched enemy soldiers strip his neighbors of their cattle, their grain, and their trucks. He had managed to save his single draft horse, only because the animal was already old, graying, and deemed completely worthless by the occupation requisition officers. That horse was his entire life. It was his tractor, his delivery truck, and his family's sole means of survival. Without it, he could not prepare the soil for the autumn sowing. Without it, his family faced starvation. Now, he sat by the road with nothing left but the dust on his boots and a dead animal in the ditch. First Lieutenant Arthur Vance was 26 years old. He came from a wealthy family in Boston, Massachusetts, and served as a junior aide in the Third Army headquarters. He wore a pristine, custom-tailored wool uniform, immaculate leather boots without a single scuff mark, and a perfectly creased garrison cap. He had never worked a field in his life. He had never known hunger, and his family wealth had insulated him from the harsh realities of the Great Depression. To Vance, the war was a series of maps, strict schedules, and logistical numbers that needed to be calculated with absolute precision. He viewed the French countryside not as farmland, but as a giant chessboard where speed was the only variable that mattered. He believed that civilian concerns were a tedious distraction from the real business of winning battles. He stood near the idling lead jeep, tapping his fingers impatiently against his leather clipboard, staring down at the old civilian with a mixture of annoyance and complete indifference. By August 1944, the Allied breakout from the Normandy beachheads had transformed the European theater into a race against time. The German front line had cracked at Avranches, opening a massive gateway into the heart of France. The American Third Army was tearing through the breach at an unprecedented pace, covering dozens of miles a day in a desperate bid to encircle the retreating enemy forces. In this high-stakes environment, fuel, ammunition, and speed were the absolute priorities of the Allied High Command. Supply lines were stretched to their absolute breaking point, winding back across hundreds of miles of ruined infrastructure to the makeshift ports on the coast. The sheer chaos of the rapid advance meant that rural communities were completely upended as mechanized divisions rolled directly through ancient family farms. In the frantic rush to maintain the momentum of the offensive, civilian problems were almost universally ignored by combat commanders. Allied regulations technically required units to document local property damage, but in the heat of a major breakthrough, these rules were brushed aside. Officers routinely let dead livestock, ruined crops, and destroyed homes slide, because any delay could allow the enemy time to establish a new defensive line. The prevailing attitude among the staff was that civilian losses were simply the inevitable price of liberation. A single dead animal in a ditch was considered a statistical zero in the grand scheme of an army group's operational reports. The heavy trucks and armored cars kept moving forward, leaving the local inhabitants to salvage what they could from the wreckage of their livelihoods. The mechanized roar of the advance drowned out the quiet crisis unfolding in the dust by the side of the road. Captain David Miller, a 32-year-old staff officer from Columbus, Ohio, stepped out of the second vehicle in the stalled column. He walked quickly toward the front of the convoy, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust on the dry road. He saw the old farmer sitting perfectly still by the ditch, and then he looked down at the dead horse. The animal's chest was torn open, its eyes already clouding over in the mid-morning heat. Miller knelt down briefly, touched the horse's flank, and realized the loss was catastrophic for the small farm behind the stone wall. He stood up, turned toward Lieutenant Vance, and suggested they find a way to clear the path while offering some basic assistance to the old man. Lieutenant Vance did not move from his position near the hood of his vehicle. He looked at his watch, clicked his tongue in disapproval, and stated that the local population needed to move their property off the military routes immediately. He told Miller that the Third Army was not an insurance agency for French peasants. Miller kept his voice level and pointed out that the farmer was over 70 years old and completely alone. He explained that without this animal, the old man would have no way to plow his fields or survive the coming winter season. He asked Vance if they could use one of the empty supply trucks to help transport something useful for the property. Vance scoffed at the suggestion, tapping his leather clipboard hard against his thigh. He stated that every single vehicle under his supervision belonged to the United States government and was designated strictly for combat operations. He declared that the old man's personal problems were entirely irrelevant compared to the timeline of the Spearhead division. He told Miller that a single civilian was completely insignificant in the middle of a global war. Miller reminded the lieutenant that Army regulations contained specific provisions regarding cooperation with local authorities in liberated territories. He argued that leaving a destitute old man on the side of the road with a dead horse would create resentment among the population they were trying to secure. Vance stepped closer to Miller, his face tightening with sudden anger. He shouted that he did not take orders from regulators who felt sympathy for local farmers. He stated that his family had built a shipping empire by focusing exclusively on efficiency, and he intended to run his military sector the exact same way. He declared that the old man was nothing more than a minor obstacle on a map, and if the farmer could not farm, it was simply his own misfortune. He ordered the drivers to get ready to push past the ditch. Regardless of the old man's position, Miller looked at the lieutenant, realizing that the young officer had completely lost his sense of proportion. He knew the situation had escalated far beyond a simple traffic delay on a rural route. He walked back to his vehicle, picked up the radio microphone, and called headquarters to report the complete blockage of the convoy route and the behavior of the commanding aide. The detailed report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled up directly alongside the stalled lead vehicle, its metal bumper coating the roadside grass in gray dust. The 4 polished silver stars on his helmet caught the sharp glare of the afternoon sun, and the twin ivory-handled revolvers rested securely against his hips. The sudden silence that swept down the armored line was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. The general stepped out of the vehicle onto the dirt path, his boots striking the ground with a rhythmic, heavy thud. He did not look at the officers. He did not look at the column of idling tanks. He walked directly to the edge of the ditch, stood over the dead animal, and studied the wound with the quiet, intense focus of a lifelong horseman. He looked at the old man sitting on the crate, then turned his gaze slowly toward the young staff lieutenant. Patton asked how long this column had been sitting on the road. Vance stepped forward quickly, his fingers brushing against his polished leather belt, and stated that they had been delayed for 42 minutes due to the civilian obstruction. Patton asked what the lieutenant had done to resolve the delay. Vance explained that he had ordered the local inhabitant to clear his dead property from the military route so the division could proceed toward the main objective. Patton asked if the lieutenant knew what kind of horse was lying in the mud. Vance shrugged slightly and stated that it appeared to be a standard local farm animal of no military value to the United States Army. Patton studied the lieutenant for a long moment. He said that a man who cannot tell the difference between a prime draft horse and a piece of discarded equipment has no business managing the logistics of an armored spearhead. He noted that the young officer had stood by his vehicle and talked about efficiency, while an elderly civilian sat in the dust facing complete ruin. He stated that the United States Army did not cross the Atlantic Ocean to wage war against the livelihoods of 73-year-old farmers who had managed to survive 4 years of brutal foreign occupation. He pointed out that while the lieutenant enjoyed the comfort of a wealthy upbringing and a clean uniform, this old man had spent 50 years turning the soil with his bare hands to provide food for his family. He explained that a dead draft horse in this valley was the exact equivalent of a destroyed tank in a combat battalion. He stated that the column would not move another yard until this injustice was corrected. He told the lieutenant that he had exactly 2 options. He could either find a suitable replacement animal from the captured enemy supply depot within the next 60 minutes, or he could personally pull a standard wooden plow through the old man's northern field until the autumn sowing was completely finished. He told the young officer to make his choice immediately. Vance grew completely pale, his hands trembling against his clipboard as he looked at the general's cold, unchanging expression. He swallowed hard and whispered that he would find the horse. Lieutenant Vance immediately dispatched 3 military police officers in a heavy utility truck to the nearby captured enemy logistics depot at Avranches. The soldiers searched through rows of confiscated equipment and livestock until they located a massive, heavily muscled German draft horse that had been abandoned during the retreat. The animal was a powerful stallion with thick legs and a calm temperament, perfectly suited for heavy agricultural labor. Within 45 minutes, the truck returned to the roadside, its heavy wooden tailgate dropping open, with a loud metallic crash that echoed across the dry fields. The young lieutenant personally led the massive animal down the ramp by its leather halter, his immaculate boots sinking into the deep mud of the ditch. A crowd of 30 combat engineers and tank crewmen gathered along the edge of the road, watching silently as the wealthy Boston officer struggled to guide the heavy horse toward the stone fence. The old farmer did not rise from his wooden crate immediately. He watched the animal approach, his weathered face completely blank, until he recognized the sheer strength of the beast. Vance handed the thick lead rope to the old man, his hands trembling slightly from the exertion and the humiliation of the public task. The nearby soldiers watched the exchange without making a sound, the mechanized rumble of the idling convoy engines filling the humid summer air as the new horse stood firmly on the French soil. Jacques Moreau survived the bitter winter of 1944, using the strength of the captured German draft horse to complete his autumn plowing on schedule. He remained on his family land outside of Avranches long after the Allied divisions had crossed the Rhine, continuing to farm the rocky soil until his peaceful death in 1958. The massive animal lived out its natural days on the property, working the fields every season, and the Moreau family always kept the leather halter hanging on a wooden peg near the barn door as a reminder of the afternoon the armored column stopped. Lieutenant Arthur Vance was reassigned to a secondary communications depot in the rear echelon 3 weeks after the confrontation on the rural road. He returned to his family's shipping business in Boston, Massachusetts, following his formal discharge from the military service in 1946. He lived a quiet, unremarkable life within his wealthy social circles, never speaking to his colleagues or his children about his time in the Normandy campaign, and died in 1982, with his bitter resentment toward frontline commanders completely intact. General George S. Patton never mentioned the incident by the roadside near Avranches in his official diaries or his public briefings. He only recorded a single brief line in a personal letter sent to his wife late that August, noting that a real soldier must always understand the true value of a good horse. Some historians have argued that the decision to halt a primary combat column during a major breakthrough campaign was an unnecessary tactical risk that violated basic logistical doctrines. They contend that a field commander's exclusive responsibility is the rapid destruction of enemy forces, and that diversion of resources to individual civilian problems sets a dangerous precedent in active war zones. Others have argued the exact opposite, maintaining that unexpected acts of decisive authority are precisely what solidifies the moral legitimacy of an occupying army. They suggest that true leadership requires an understanding of the human landscape as well as the military one. What is certain is that the replacement draft horse remained at the Avranches farm for the rest of its life. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have ordered the column to keep moving and dealt with the farmer's loss through official administrative channels after the breakthrough? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what the general did when no one was watching, make sure to subscribe.